Well, fake news has become perhaps the most significant phrase in the political lexicon these days. There's so much fake news emanating from the elite establishment media and so little time to chronicle it. But we're going to talk about a couple of the most prominent pieces of fake news or grossly misleading news that we did this on Liberty Nation TV's Roundtable with our authors this week. Political correspondent Graham Noble took on the establishment media narrative that Trump's attacks on them amount to some unacceptable and sinister totalitarian assault on free speech, pointing out that tension between the president and the press is hardly a new phenomenon. It goes back all the way to the country's founding.
The idea of, a president being hostile towards the media as if this is some kind of new horror that we're facing is ridiculous. Thomas Jefferson was not a fan of the media at all. The media didn't like him either. And even though he was a huge believer in freedom of the press, he was also a believer in the idea that everybody who could read a newspaper was able to actually understand what they were reading. So in a way, he was saying that freedom of the press is a great thing as long as what the people are reading in the press is actually accurate, an accurate reflection of what is actually happening. I think Thomas Jefferson would have been horrified at the way the media conducts themselves today. He was once reported to have written that the only honest thing you will read in a newspaper is the advertisements.
And we all know how misleading the ads can be. But while the battle rages in the swamp between the power brokers and political insiders, what about the normal folks and the rest of the country who have their beliefs but don't spend much time thinking about politics and witness this circus in the swamp from afar? Graham Noble says they're mostly driven by what is called confirmation bias.
Those who are neither especially pro-Trump or especially anti-Trump will probably lean towards whichever news reports tend to line up with what they at least suspect or don't suspect about the president. I think really the whole, in general though, we've really got to the point where I think the majority of Americans, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they're on, are highly suspicious of at least the establishment media. And I think we've gotten to the point where a lot of people have got their favorite sources, and they go to them and they tend not to trust anybody outside of those sources.
And for the left, one of the most reliable anti-Trump elite media sources, given their fame, their reach, their resources, is the Washington Post, home of multiple instances of fake or grossly misleading or distorted news designed to throw you off the scent of what's really important, little things like the economy and jobs. The Post published a breathless piece this week that leads with the idea that President Trump is in full meltdown about Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation and how it may affect his son, Donald Trump Jr. And our newest LibertyNation.com author, longtime editor and writer at the Washington Times, Joe Schaefer, makes the important point about fake news. It's that it's hardly limited to false stories.
There's a different way of looking at fake news than just what they're writing. It's they're covering this, they're hyping this Robert Mueller investigation, and Donald Trump Jr. met once with this woman who has some ties to the Kremlin, but he was looking for opposition research on a political opponent, which is really surprising in politics. No one's ever done that. No. And he apparently didn't get anything. But so this goes into this thing called the 24-hour news cycle, which is this hyper rapid fire kind of electrified tunnel. And so big organizations like the Washington Post, CNN, these people who anoint themselves as the news, they control the narrative with what they're reporting, but also with what's not being reported. So in the article, I kind of put that with the Dianne Feinstein story that's come out, where she had an actual Chinese communist spy on her personal staff for 20 years. In the Washington Post, at the time I wrote the article, and I checked this morning, they still haven't written about this article.
And that was 2 days after the major news that Senator Feinstein had employed as a driver, doubtless overhearing many a confidential conversation for 20 years, a Chinese communist spy. But it's not Russia and it's not Trump, so it does not matter. Indeed, we often think about fake news as acts of commission by the establishment media reporting false stories, when in fact you could argue that it's the stories they omit that are even more damaging, not reporting or downplaying, among other things, the over 4% economic growth in the last quarter, record low unemployment for blacks and Hispanics and women and people with disabilities. The sins of omission are really just as bad, if not worse, as the media's sins of commission. Joe Schaefer said this reveals and continues the underlying fake narrative.
The narrative that they're pursuing is that Russia is our enemy, which they're not the Soviet Union anymore. We're not in a state of a Cold War with them anymore. But as we all remember, this is the same Washington Post that laughed at Mitt Romney when he brought that up during the 2012 election. All of a sudden, Obama's quote, the 1980s want your foreign policy back. Well, okay, it's now Trump's in there, and Trump wants us to have potentially good relations with Russia if we can. Well, this is a weapon we can use against Trump, so now Russia's the bad guy. It's expediency. It's whatever weapon that they need when they need it, and principle doesn't really come into it a lot. The new journalism has released so much, the internet too. There's so much information out there now for people. But the mainstream media, the Washington Post, they still want to be the referee. They want to be the authority figure. Problem is, they also want to get in the fight. It's sort of like a boxing match where the referee pushes one guy out and says, I'm fighting this guy now. And he starts throwing punches. Then the opponent punches back, and you can't do that. I'm the referee. You can't hit the referee. We get to tell you what's news and what isn't news. And if you dare to criticize us, democracy dies in darkness.
Democracy dies in darkness. The slogan of the Washington Post. Seriously. Democracy dies in darkness. The slogan of the Washington Post. Seriously.